voting. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to motion 2 on the Human Medicines Amendment Regulations 2019. Jonathan Ashworth to move.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to move the motion that stands in the name of my humble friend and myself to revoke the Human Medicines Amendment Regulations. This refers to something called the Serious Shortages Protocol, and can I start by putting my thanks on the record to the business managers for allowing us time to have this debate, but it really shouldn't have come about as a result of a prayer motion from the official opposition. The government should have brought these proposals for full debate and scrutiny in the House, because this statutory instrument, the so-called Serious Shortages Protocol, is, I think, perhaps one of the most far-reaching and contentious of the government's changes to medicines regulations in recent times. The government are here using Henry VIII powers to enable ministers to issue a serious shortage protocol for pharmacists to follow. It states that it could be issued in case of a serious national shortage and would enable community pharmacists and other dispensers to dispense in accordance with the protocol rather than the prescription without contacting the GP. These changes, these reforms, represent a quite extraordinary power grab where ministers themselves can grant themselves the authority to instruct local pharmacists to ration drugs, overrule the GP's prescription and dispense therapeutic generic equivalents or reduce dosages in the event of a medicines shortage. Changes as far-reaching... Of course I will, to my honourable gentleman.
Grateful to for giving way. Is he aware of the particular concern amongst people with epilepsy who absolutely require consistency of supply, and any change to medication can potentially have dire consequences? And SUDEP Action, a brilliant organisation, has raised very specific concerns about the risks to people with epilepsy.
And he's quite right to raise those particular concerns about patients with epilepsy, which I will touch on in the course of my remarks, and actually will echo the point that he has just made with great eloquence. So these changes do represent an extraordinary power grab, but quite frankly, ministers should have brought these changes to the House for proper scrutiny, and then of course they should have gone out for proper consultation with patients and patient groups and health stakeholders. That is why the Academy of Royal Colleges stated, for example, that it is, quote, inexplicable and unacceptable that an issue of this importance is not the subject of wide consultation, and that medical Royal Colleges as doctors' professional bodies were not specifically engaged in the process. The BMA said, quote, they should have far more time to adequately consider the government's proposals for change. So that is why we brought the prayer motion, and as I say, I'm pleased that we've had the opportunity to debate these proposals today. It's worth just saying a word about the context in which we debate these proposals, notwithstanding the confusion on the government benches about when we actually do exit the European Union, and the Honourable Member for Spelfon has not given us any greater guidance today in his remarks at the dispatch box. But it's worth recalling, as the Lancet said just last month, that Brexit, especially a no deal, will affect, quote, the healthcare workforce, NHS financing, availability of medicines and vaccines, sharing of information and medical research. We know that our effective joint working with our European partners has been vital for the NHS over recent years in everything from infectious disease control to the licensing, sale and regulation of medicines. We know that developing new medicines depends on the international cooperation that is fundamental to accessing clinical trials. Patients in the UK are able currently to access EU-wide trials for new treatment, and the UK has the highest number of Phase 1 clinical trials across the EU. And thanks to the strength of our pharmaceutical base, every month 45 million packs of medicine move from the UK to the EU, with 37 million packs of medicine going from the EU to the UK. 99% of the insulin used in the United Kingdom is manufactured in the UK, and current EU legislation allows for the legitimate trading of medicines quickly and swiftly cross-border, but the cost of no deal could see pharmaceutical products subject to 44 separate checks and controls at the borders, hugely delaying access to medicines.
Honourable friend, give way.
Of course I will.
I'm very grateful to him. He's making some very, very important points. I wonder if there's senior advice from the UK Bioindustry Association, who do know what's going on in the life sciences sector, who say despite the expertise and efforts of the MHRA, with just 12 days to go to Brexit, preparing for a no deal is an impossible task.
I thank my honourable friend for Cambridge, and as a Member of Parliament for Cambridge, he works very closely with the life sciences and pharmaceuticals industry, and he's a great champion for them, and he is quite right to raise those concerns. So it's not clear if we are leaving the EU in 12 days. I mean, the Minister at the dispatch box earlier was pretty hopeless in giving the House any clarity on that matter. I suppose we'll have to wait for further statements from the government tomorrow on that, unless the Health Minister wants to clarify matters for us in a moment or two. But one of the issues which the organisation my honourable friend referred to that they are concerned about is, of course, the parallel trade in medicines as well, where pharmaceutical exporters seeking to profit from currency fluctuations could see medicines intended to meet UK patient requirements quickly distributed out to the EU because of the advantage that perhaps a fall in sterling could accrue to them in those circumstances. These are the reasons why we have had and seen widespread concerns of medicine shortages in the event of no deal. For example, diabetes... yes, of course.
Will you accept that this isn't something in the future, that I'm already getting reports back that certain medicines are in short supply, and patients are being advised to go back to their GPs to see if there are alternatives, because somebody somewhere is already stockpiling and there is not the flow through? Would he accept that?
For Shroud raises a very important point, and indeed there have been reports of shortages in certain medicines. Naproxen and arthritis medicine, we've heard of shortages of that in recent weeks, for EpiPens a few weeks ago. I've even heard some community pharmacists have told me, I appreciate this is anecdotal, but I've heard from community pharmacists directly themselves there's even a shortage of aspirin. I emphasise that's anecdotal. I've not seen any national reporting of that. This is what community pharmacists have told me when I've been in their pharmacists and discussing this with them. So I do emphasise that is an anecdotal report rather than something based on any national reporting that I have seen. But yes, there are shortages now as a result of the uncertainty in the pharmaceutical market. So, Diabetes UK have warned that this is their quotes, despite reaching out directly to the Department of Health and Social Care in December, we still not have seen the concrete detail needed to reassure us, or people with diabetes, that the UK government plans are robust enough to guarantee no impact on insulin and medicine supplies in the event of no-deal Brexit. And it was a similar story from the epilepsy bodies, who said, quote, we do not have confidence in the current arrangements to ensure the continuity of life-saving medications for people with epilepsy. Now, the government has sought to reassure patients that its contingency plans are fail-safe, but the same Lancet report I referenced previously also said that stockpiling arrangements cannot cope for more than a few weeks. It also noted that some effective products, such as radioisotopes needed for treating some types of cancer, simply cannot be stockpiled. And this chimes with the Royal College of Radiologists, who last month issued staggering concerns about the supply of medical isotopes, spelling out how the expected disruption would force clinicians to alter treatment plans and mean the prioritisation of some cancer patients over others. It's why the government is proposing this serious shortages protocol contained in this statutory instrument, and effectively using Henry VIII powers to enable ministers to issue a protocol to pharmacies for them to follow. As I've said, this is an extraordinary paragraph, because what it will effectively mean is that a GP's prescription can be changed by a pharmacist. No longer would a medicine be prescribed by a doctor who knows the medical history of the patient. Instead, it would be a pharmacist acting in accordance with a protocol drawn up by the government. It's why these emergency measures have quite rightly raised alarm amongst various patient groups, because these changes could cause real problems for people with long-term conditions. Of course.
Except to that very point, that actually what would be sensible if there was a sunset clause here, because clearly the issue of giving that much power to a pharmacist as opposed to the physician who knows the patient is very dangerous if it's going to be long-term perpetual, not just to deal with the current crisis.
The lady makes an entirely reasonable observation, and I trust that the Minister on the Treasury bench took note of it, and I look forward to her reply to that particular point. Yes, of course.
Very grateful to him again for giving way. Does he agree that this actually puts pharmacists, individual pharmacists, into quite an invidious position, because they may well be having to make decisions which may impact adversely on a patient's health and well-being when they are not necessarily skilled to make those judgments? My concern particularly relating to epilepsy, but it applies to other areas as well.
The honourable gentleman hits the nail on the head, and this is exactly the point that has been put to me when I visited community pharmacists and discussed this with them. Now, of course, there are other pharmacists who perhaps have done more training and want to work at the top of their licence, as it were, and believe that there is a role for more autonomy. But there is real concerns about the way in which these changes are being rushed through without any resource put into the education, the explanation, perhaps the wider training that may be needed. And I think in those circumstances, it's appropriate that we raise our concerns and indeed oppose this motion or support the motion that we are bringing and oppose the government's proposals today. But the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. I've heard that concern directly, and many community pharmacists don't necessarily want this responsibility, given the wider concerns and the wider implications that you have highlighted. Yes, Bishop Auckland.
Thank you very much. Further to the point that's just been made by the Right Honourable Member for Norfolk, it raises two issues, doesn't it? One, what's the point of doctors having all this training if anybody without this training is suddenly able to dole out prescriptions? And two, are the pharmacists insured, and is there an insurance scheme for them if they do make these mistakes? Because doctors have a whole professional insurance system and pharmacists presumably have a completely different one.
Well, my honourable friend from Bishop Auckland is absolutely right. That is exactly the point a community pharmacist put to me in Loughborough about 3 weeks ago when I was visiting them to discuss this. And also echoing the point that my honourable friend has made, the BMA has said it does not support a blanket approach to allowing pharmacists to provide therapeutic equivalents where a prescribed drug is not available. Or perhaps the National Aid Trusts who have said that the only person qualified to safely alter the medication prescribed to a person living with HIV is that person's HIV consultant. And SUDEP Action, alongside the broader coalition of epilepsy charities, which the Right Honourable Gentleman from Norfolk mentioned in his early interventions, are particularly worried about these proposals. Now, after facing pressure from these groups, the government has accepted that replacement drugs were unsuitable for epilepsy patients, but they have left it open to pharmacists to reduce the strength or dosage of epilepsy medication. And I am not convinced that this will eliminate the big risks faced by these patients, as the Honourable Gentleman said. Many patients with epilepsy are on other medications, especially the elderly, and any changes require careful management because of the interaction between different medicines. And up to 90% of people with epilepsy state that even a deterioration in their mood can have a negative effect on seizure control, and anti-epileptic medications have more significant interactions than any other group of drugs. There are situations where the specific brand, type, form or strength of a treatment must be carefully tailored to the individual based on their individual responses, which is done by the prescriber and the patient over time. If this is changed by a professional who does not know the patient or the individual risks of that patient, some have warned the consequences could be a loss of control of the condition, failed treatment, an unnecessary emergency with some very serious consequences indeed. Of course I will.
Making an absolutely first-class point. This really puts patients at risk, and it is not appropriate that the pharmacist makes that decision. People think generics are the same thing as a branded drug. They're not. For some, a particular brand is absolutely crucial. So I commend him for what he's doing.
I'm flattered to receive such commendation from the Conservative benches, and I commend her for an extremely well-made point, which I agree with entirely, and I hope the Minister responds to the very good point that she has made, the second very good point that she has made in the course of this debate. So the stakes are too high if we get this wrong, and yet there has been no impact assessment or risk assessment undertaking as part of this SI on the serious shortages protocol. I mean, this is an unacceptable risk to anyone with a long-term condition and should be recognised by anyone making contingency plans. And I was particularly horrified to read in the explanatory memorandum for this SI, and this is what it said. It was quite shocking, I thought. The main benefits of the protocol would be the NHS cost savings associated with GP time. Then in the same breath, it casually goes on to say, quotes, there may be some risks to patients. This is the government's own paperwork. This is astonishing. I mean, how can the government seriously prioritise NHS cost savings over the lives of patients and allows a memorandum, an explanatory memorandum, to go out with that sort of wording in it? I hope the Minister can explain how that got in there, or at least reassure us that the quote, there may be some risks to patients, is not actually the position of the government. And if it is the position of the government that there may be some risks to patients, doesn't that suggest they should have come to the House sooner to explain why they're taking this piece of regulatory change through and not left it to the official opposition to bring forward a prayer motion in order to get the debate today? So there are a few things that I would like clarity on from the government. It isn't entirely clear from this legislation on exactly when these powers would be used. I would like to hear from the Minister on whether this will be brought in under a no-deal Brexit scenario only, or whether we can expect it to be a more permanent power. I'm also concerned that there will only be a review of new powers 1 year after the full shortage is called by ministers. This speaks to the point that the Honourable Lady from Newton Abbott was making a few moments ago. Because 1 year, I believe, is too long a time to wait if this does cause serious problems for patients and the wider sector. Considering again that the stakes are so high, it would be essential that the government delivers extensive communication, training to GPs, training to pharmacists, training to other healthcare professionals and the public to both help understand any new protocols as well as manage expectations and any dissatisfaction. I'd be grateful if the Minister could outline their plans on this front as well in her response in a few moments. Now, obviously, I talk and listen to frontline NHS staff all the time, and I know there is a well-founded fear about the implications of a no-deal Brexit and what that will have for hundreds of thousands in need of life-saving medicines. So I'd be very interested to hear from the Minister on what information around this protocol has been shared with the health sector and professionals involved. When the Secretary of State gave evidence a few weeks ago, to the Health Select Committee, he glibly informed them that he will prioritise medicines over food. I'm afraid that glib assertion from the Secretary of State has hardly offered the reassurance that patients deserve. Brexit should not compromise patient safety in any way. It will be up to the Minister in a few moments to allay our widespread concerns, but if she is not able to, we will test the opinion of the House, and I commend our motion tonight.
The question is that motion number 2 is on the order paper. Minister Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I am grateful for the opportunity to address the House and perhaps reassure honourable members on all sides about the purposes of these regulations. And I've been given a number of questions which I hope I will try and answer all of them as best I can. I just want to start by saying that there is considerable misinformation out there about these regulations, which are designed to most efficiently manage the supply of medicines in the event of a shortage. And I should also make very clear to the House that this is not just a Brexit regulation. It will be applying in any case. It's not just in the case of no deal, not least because we've had recent events which have showed the challenge in managing medicines. And I would also say that the regulations around how pharmacists will be able to apply this protocol are designed to, yes, of course, to minimise demand on GPs, but also to minimise risk to patients, because pharmacists will only be able to use their powers under these regulations under very clear criteria. And actually, we'll still encourage them to speak to prescribers where there's any element of doubt.
Minister, give way.
Yes, indeed.
Could you give us some details, perhaps, as to what those particular criteria are that are going to be in place, the protocol, so that very clear decisions can be made by a pharmacist, and that when there is a real issue for a patient, for a particular brand is really important, there is no possibility that a generic will be substituted.
So the circumstances will be different from protocol to protocol, which is not a very clear answer, but we would obviously have to look at each incident. But if I could perhaps give an example. The Honourable Gentleman mentioned HIV medicine. Other examples are, for example, antipsychotic medicines, where there's a very clear relationship with the patient. Obviously, it would not be appropriate to unilaterally change those items of medication. However, when a prescription is issued, the pharmacist has to dispense that medicine in strict instructions under the terms of the prescription. So, for example, if it was for packets of 200 milligram tablets and we had a shortage of that supply, they could be substituted with a different kind of measurement. But all of those issues would be dealt with from protocol to protocol, having had the consideration of a pharmacy panel who can properly and rigorously challenge as to what would be an appropriate substitute in the event of a shortage of any medicine.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Is she not concerned that the challenge here is, however qualified the pharmacist, they don't have the patient's notes? And she's referred to amount, and I understand that, and having two smaller pills equaling what should have been prescribed. But when it's a generic versus a specific branded medicine, that's a very, very difficult, challenging decision to make.
To what I said earlier in response to the Honourable Lady, the terms under which pharmacists will be able to exercise their discretion would be clearly set out in each protocol, and there would be full consultation by an expert panel and with ministerial approval in that event. Yes, of course.
Could she clarify if there are adverse effects as a result of some change that has been made in these circumstances? Will it be the prescriber or the dispenser or the government who would ultimately be liable?
The protocol will be very tightly drafted, so it would actually really limit the ability of the pharmacist. They would only be able to prescribe outside the terms of the prescription within the narrow confines of the protocol. And as I say, this is done to secure continuity of supply when there is a potential challenge. But I would expect to take advice from the pharmacy panel in conjunction with those most affected to make sure that we can put appropriate risk management in place in those occasions.
What kind of timescale is the Minister considering? As my right honourable friend said from the dispatch box, take people with epilepsy. It might take 6 months if somebody's condition changes to work out what the right prescription ought to be. The Minister can't surely say that we can write a protocol in Whitehall in the event of some sudden shortage and implement it across the land, because different people, as we keep saying, different people have different medical needs.
So there, in response to my lady, is we are dealing with a protocol that can deal with an immediate shortage, but we would not expect that shortage to continue indefinitely. So that enables us to manage that shortage whilst trying to secure that ongoing supply. And reference has been made to EpiPens. That's exactly what happened in that context. We knew we had a shortage. We knew there was a supply coming, so there were steps taken to manage so that everybody who needed EpiPens had a supply of 2, but dispensaries were managing that supply, and we'd expect the same thing to happen. So where we'd issue a protocol, we would expect prescribers to go back to their normal supply medication, once we corrected that supply. But this is really to get us through, so almost also to encourage people not to stockpile medicines in the event of worries about shortage. This is about giving people the reassurance that we will manage those shortages effectively. Now, the Honourable Gentleman mentioned that there had been criticism of a lack of consultation. It's worth just noting that the Government has been challenged by the Good Law Project on a number of grounds. But it's also worth telling the House that last week the Court decided that permission for judicial review would not be granted on the issue of lack of consultation. To actually put in clarity the purpose of these regulations, firstly, they implement the EU falsified medicines legislation on safety features on packaging of medicines. They also extend the exemption for the supply of naloxone hydrochloride so that drug treatment services can supply all dosage forms of that medicine. At the moment, we can only supply injectables, whereas we now know that nasal administration is more efficient. And it's also, obviously, the main crux of the debate here today. It enables retail pharmacies, where appropriate, to supply against a serious shortage protocol, instead of against the prescriptions if such a protocol has been issued. Now, not implementing this statutory instrument would have dire consequences. Not only would the government lose this tool to manage shortage of medicines, but we'd also deny drug treatment services the ability to supply all dosage forms of naloxone hydrochloride. And without this SI, we would not be able to introduce UK-specific flexibilities for the Falsified Medicines Safety Features scheme, meaning that a disproportionate burden would be put on the supply chain. Now, on the safety features, I'd like to say that we are committed to stopping falsified medicines from reaching patients, and our number one priority here is safe access to medicines in the most efficient way. I can also say that we do want to retain a close working partnership with the EU on medicines regulations for all the reasons the Honourable Gentleman outlined, and we do wish to ensure that patients continue to have timely access to safe medicines and medical innovations. The new safety features measures under the EU Delegated Safety Features Regulation are directly applicable and already require UK manufacturers to place a unique identifier and tamper-evident features on packaging for almost all prescription-only medicines. These medicines will then need to be scanned on supply to the patient to verify their authenticity. And our position is clear that as a Member State we were obliged to implement these requirements. We worked extensively with stakeholders to understand the detail and to develop the best approach on the flexibilities and enforcement specific for the UK, and this was then tested through a consultation process. Now, it's worth noting that the UK has a very complex supply chain, and without the national flexibilities in this statutory instrument, the burden on industry would be disproportionate and risk patients not getting timely access to medicines. Nor would we be able to enforce the requirements that are already in place, and the reputation of UK medicines and the UK pharmaceutical industry and regulators could be seriously undermined. Now, I've already mentioned the issue regarding naloxone hydrochloride. That is something that is administered in the event of heroin overdose, so clearly we want to make that available in the most efficient way possible. But coming back now to the serious shortage protocol provisions that will provide the government with an additional tool to deal with shortage of medicines. Now, over 2.5 million prescription items are dispensed in primary care in England alone every day, and the vast majority are not subject to supply problems. However, we must have a robust system in place for when they do. We work closely with the MHRA, the pharmaceutical industry and NHS England in operating and managing the supply chain to help prevent shortages and to ensure that the risks to patients are minimised when they do arise. Now, the issue of EpiPens is a very good example. In autumn last year, we faced a serious international shortage of EpiPens. That shortage had a knock-on effect on other adrenaline auto-injectors, and despite efforts by the department and the industry, there was not enough supply to meet the demand in the country. We were therefore forced to ration the available injectors so that the available supply could be spread out across all patients who needed them until more stock would become available. And to enable us to do this, we put a dispensing protocol in place. That protocol required pharmacists to check with patients how many adrenaline injectors, including expired ones, they had, so that pharmacists could decide on the number of injectors to supply. Patients below a certain weight had to be referred back to their prescriber, which is again another risk management tool that we would apply during the issue of a protocol to make sure that pharmacists were referring people back to their prescriber if there was a question. And this ensured that throughout the duration of the shortage, we managed the available stock in such a way that each patient had access to at least 2 injectors. And it was this incident with the adrenaline injectors, as well as our EU exit preparations, that led the government to formalise that what was done in the EpiPen situation should be put in place to manage other shortages should they arise. So I can say again that this is not the government's plan for dealing with medicine shortage in a no-deal exit. This is simply not the case at all. We wanted to introduce these provisions before the 29th of March so that we would have the option of issuing protocols, but only as part of our multi-layered approach to minimise any supply disruption in a no-deal exit. And we are confident that our other management plans will deal with that. These include securing additional roll-on, roll-off freight capacity for goods. They also include buffer stocks and stockpiling, extra warehouse space and space on aeroplanes for products with short shelf life or specific storage conditions, of which the questions raised with regard to radioisotopes are clearly relevant too. These regulations will ensure that companies continue to sell their products in the UK. They will strengthen the process and resources used to deal with shortages in the event that they do occur, despite everyone's best efforts. Now,
yes. She's been very generous with her time. Could you explain to me currently what happens when there is a shortage? I find it extraordinary because, of course, I appreciate that patients need medicines. Why specifically do we need this piece of legislation when the government so far has dealt with many other examples of shortages, I would have thought, reasonably adequately?
As I've just explained, it was the issues with regard to the EpiPens which actually brought home to us the need to have a suitable protocol in place. Now, I know a number of members have raised issues and worries about the role of pharmacists under this system. Now, at the moment, any retail pharmacist must, where the prescriber has prescribed a specific medicine, including a specific strength and quantity, must supply exactly what is on the prescription, and they cannot deviate from that. So the pharmacist has no flexibility if the exact order cannot be supplied. For example, because of supply issues, the pharmacist has to send the patient back to their GP. And clearly that would not be an efficient use of GP's time if we can actually put in place a protocol which would enable the application of alternative medicines. The serious shortage protocol therefore enables retail pharmacists to supply in accordance with a strict protocol for a specific prescription-only medicine rather than against a prescription without going back to the prescriber. But this will be done in only very exceptional circumstances, only in the event of a very serious shortage of a medicine, when all other mitigation measures have been exhausted or be likely to be ineffective, and that all the clinical community think it is appropriate to issue such a protocol. The protocol may prescribe one of the following options. It could prescribe an alternative quantity, it could prescribe an alternative pharmaceutical form, an alternative strength, a therapeutic equivalent, or a generic equivalent. But as I said before, that will be in line with specific, each case will be considered on its merits, and of course the risk given various health conditions would have to be borne in mind. We believe that the substitution for therapeutic substitution would be extremely rare, and it would need to be clinically appropriate, and there would also need to be a sufficient stock of any alternative. As I've said, any serious shortage protocol will be developed with clinician input. Which clinicians are involved will depend on the expertise that is required, but we would involve, for example, the relevant royal colleges and societies. And we'd also work closely with patient representative groups, like we did in the EpiPen shortage. Each protocol would clearly set out what action can be taken by the retail pharmacy, under what circumstances, for which patients and during which period. And I'd like to just re-emphasise that this is not about pharmacists acquiring prescribing rights by the back door. It is entirely about ensuring that patients have access to the medicines they need by making the best possible use of highly qualified pharmacists and freeing up GP time for patients who need to see their GP. If a pharmacist is in any doubt, they can always exercise their professional judgment to refer the individual patient back to the GP if they have any concerns about what they're prescribing. And if patients do not want to get the alternative under the protocol, then they can, of course, always go back to their prescriber. But let me be very clear again. Patients will not be given alternative medicines where this is not medically appropriate. That includes patients with complex medication regimes, with conditions, as we've heard, such as epilepsy or HIV. But it doesn't mean that they're exempt from the protocols. For example, a protocol for reduced quantity of anti-epilepsy medication could be issued, as we did for the EpiPen. But this will have to be considered against the backdrop of all the available stock being spread out across all patients. So there's time for their patients to see their prescriber if the supply issues will become a long-term issue. Without the protocol, some patients would receive the medicines prescribed to them, but some would leave the pharmacy empty-handed, and clearly we need to make sure that all patients have timely access to their medicines. In the event of a serious shortage of any medicine, it is vital that patients continue to receive the treatment that they need. The introduction of strict protocols developed with specialist doctors is a sensible step which will, in exceptional circumstances, allow highly trained pharmacists to provide an appropriate alternative or quantity as set out in the protocol in order to reduce the impact on patients. This ensures a coordinated response to a shortage and timely access to medicines. I, of course, hope that we never have to introduce a serious shortage protocol, but there may be times that we have no other options because all other measures have been exhausted or will be likely to be ineffective. The introduction of strict protocols developed with specialist doctors is a sensible step which will, in exceptional circumstances, allow highly trained pharmacists to provide an appropriate alternative. So not implementing this statutory instrument means that patients' timely access to medicine is at risk. First, by not enabling drug treatment services to supply all dosage forms of naloxone hydrochloride. Second, by imposing much more burdensome implementation of the safety features on packs of medicines with flexibility to accommodate the specific characteristics of the UK supply chain. And third, by denying the government an important tool to manage the shortages of medicines and ensure that patients continue to get the right medicines in a timely manner. I therefore hope this motion is defeated.
Dr. Philip of Whitford.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Obviously, we're talking about changes to the Human Medicines Regulations of 2012. Now, I welcome the implementation of the Falsified Medicines Directive with a unique identifier and anti-tampering devices. I also welcome the change to allow nasal naloxone to be used to deal with opioid overdose. But snuck in among those things that are perfectly reasonable is the serious shortage protocol. Now, this deals with prescription-only medicines and highlights what we are facing with Brexit coming in 11 days. 41 million packets of drugs a month go from the UK to the EU, and 37 million are imported in the other direction, including almost all insulin. The UK doesn't largely produce insulin. And the problem is there are many other drugs that the UK doesn't really produce. And we have raised the issues of radioisotopes previously and in this debate, although it clearly doesn't apply to this. There are also going to be issues with the supply chain of raw chemicals to actually produce drugs in the UK, and things like batch testing at the end of the process for UK exporters into the EU, because they will not recognise batch testing that isn't carried out inside the EU. One of the key words missing in the Withdrawal Act that appeared scattered throughout the Chequers deal, if we can call it that, is the word frictionless. You can do a word search and it isn't there. So while we're discussing this in the context of no deal, there will be issues regarding the supply chains in making drugs and moving drugs around, even if the government's withdrawal agreement went through. Now, bizarrely, in Clause 8 of the explanatory notes, it claims, and I quote, "The SI does not relate to withdrawal from the European Union." Now, as what we would say in Scotland, aye, right. But it goes on, if withdrawal from the EU was a contributing factor to serious shortages of drugs, then the serious shortage protocol could be used. That is the thinnest fig leaf I have ever seen in my whole life. Now, it talks about the minister being able to add drugs onto this serious shortage protocol list, or ministers. And I would be grateful if the Minister can clarify who she means by plural. Are we talking about the devolved ministers in Edinburgh, in Cardiff, or are we merely talking about all of the junior ministers and Secretary of State here in Westminster? Because health is devolved, and the use of drugs and indeed the diseases dealt with vary across the UK. And it is important that we are not seeing health being pulled back away from devolution. So I would like that to be clarified, particularly when the Minister suggests this is not just a short-term solution, but is actually envisaged as a long-term solution for shortages. Now, I do accept there can be shortages, but they are normally quite small in number. It is normally possible to get access to information about what's causing them, and therefore it becomes easier to come up with solutions. But as has been said, this is only going to be reviewed in a year. That's quite a long time for this protocol to be in place. What replacements could be used would be useful to send to the GP or prescriber rather than to pharmacists. Why wait until the point of dispensing the drug if you know there's a national shortage of it? Tell GPs, tell non-GP prescribers. Don't leave it to the last minute when someone is in the pharmacy. Because that's the issue, is that this shortage protocol is giving pharmacists the power to override the prescriber. That's predominantly a GP, but not necessarily a GP. Now, they can change the strength, not the dose, I would say to other members. It does not say changing the dose. It says changing the strength. So if someone is on a 10 milligram tablet and they're used to taking one 10 milligram tablet, they may be given 2 5 milligram tablets. Now, that may seem very innocuous, but an elderly or vulnerable or slightly confused patient who knows they take one tablet every morning may end up taking half the dose they require. Even worse if they had to be given a larger dose that they were meant to cut in half, because that's much more complex. So that the number of tablets they have to take could cause confusion. It talks about quantity. At the moment, patients are usually given 8 weeks of a prescription, and they pay a prescription charge. So if they're only going to get 4 weeks of their medication, will they get the second 4 weeks without paying another prescription charge? Or is this actually going to double prescription charges for patients? That isn't an issue for us in Scotland, but it's certainly an issue here in England. It talks about...
My honourable friend was speaking very knowledgeably about dosage, and for particular people, and many of my constituents are on methadone prescriptions, they need to get that amount of prescription, and it can have very real consequences for relapse and for how they're able to live their lives. Would you agree with me that there has to be particular protections put in place for groups for whom removing the dose could have very, very severe consequences?
Good point. I think it is critical that the patient's dose is not changed and is not put in danger, because the management of any condition is dose sensitive. We can't go down to homeopathic doses of antibiotics or blood pressure medication. That would just be absolutely crazy. They can give a different form, liquid, solid, capsule. Again, for some patients, that may not be a problem. For others, it will. Or generic, as the Honourable Lady opposite for Newton Abbott mentioned. Some patients, now generally NHS prescribers use generic as default to save money. But I've had patients for whom the generic form of tamoxifen gave them appalling side effects, where the non-generic brand didn't. So there always has to be that right for GPs to say, actually, in this case, I will use brand. But the most important bit of this is that it allows a change to a completely different drug. Now, this may be a drug that's advised by a panel sitting somewhere in London with the colleges who say that's a reasonable replacement for the other drug. But it doesn't take into account that patients are all individuals. And I can tell you, they are all individuals. Pharmacists are very knowledgeable, and in Scotland we've had community pharmacists for over a decade, and they contribute massively. but they work to their own protocol. They work within limits, and they do not have access to the patient's notes. So they cannot see that the patient has been on this drug in the past and had terrible side effects with it. So they are going to replace with this protocol drug. But as has been said, what about the responsibility? And why is this happening right now? This suggests to me that actually the Department of Health are expecting massive shortages to the point where the simple act of picking up the phone and speaking to the GP and saying, I don't have drug A, would drug B be reasonable for Mrs. Smith, is somehow considered impractical. And I find that very worrying. It may be that Mrs. Smith has actually had 6 drugs to control her blood pressure. Drug 2 and drug 5 caused her to faint or take blackouts. The pharmacist doesn't know this. Epileptics have been mentioned. The issue with epileptics is any change can destabilise their epilepsy. They are therefore never prescribed by generic, they are prescribed by brand to avoid precisely that.
She makes a very good point, and would she also agree that it's often the interaction between epilepsy drugs and other drugs that patient may be on, and any interruption to that relationship may also cause real problems?
The honourable gentleman makes a very good point, but actually that also applies to many drugs. When we are prescribing, we are sitting looking at interactions. Now, I would expect the pharmacist to be looking at that. They will have the patient's full prescription, and therefore they should be able to look at interactions.
They don't have the patient records.
But that's the key thing. Exactly. They do not have the patient's records, and they do not know what problems it may have caused in the past. With regards to epilepsy, this change could have real impact. It brings the danger of a fit. The fit itself may be a threat to them. Obviously, epileptics can suffer from sudden unexpected death in epilepsy. They are exposed to that. They can suffer from trauma, depending on where they are when they take the fit. And even just simply the loss of their driving licence for a year because they had one fit. The social impact of that on epileptics is absolutely enormous. Now, it says in the explanatory notes that because of this, epileptic drugs and biological drugs would not be considered suitable for the protocol. But it doesn't say that in the SI. They are not excluded. And I think that it is important that these people have the protection. I'll give way.
I'm really grateful to the Honourable Lady, and I've been listening closely to what she's been saying. Can I say it's already happening? A friend of mine went to her chemist to pick up some drugs. The dosage was halved by the pharmacist, not by her doctor. And she had enough drugs to keep her going to go and see the doctor again, who reinstated the original drug. I just think it's really scary at the moment. People just don't understand why this is happening, because it can't be about Brexit, because it's now.
I'm just coming on to that issue. I would reiterate again, I would imagine it's the strength rather than the dose. So she would be expected to take 2 smaller tablets, not to reduce her dose. As I've said, the obvious thing in this would be sharing the protocol with the prescribers, not aiming at the pharmacist right at the end of the process. Why is it that we are seeing these shortages now? Well, it's a simple thing. There are 2 ways to stockpile. Either you can force increased production, not necessarily within the gift of the Department of Health or even the Secretary of State, or within normal production you can set aside some of those drugs. And I have to say, when I talk to my GP friends, they talk about a massive surge in shortages over the last 9 months, and that coincides almost exactly with the acceleration of stockpiling. And so my concern is that drugs are being set aside into the stockpile but are causing shortages right now. There should be publication of the list of drugs that are at risk of shortage, so that a GP can actually look and think, well, for this lady or this gentleman, it's not that important. So if this is a shortage drug, I won't use it. But for this other patient, I will have to use it. But apparently that's currently hidden behind commercial sensitivity. I think it is important that basically consultation and impact assessment is carried out. I was shocked that the BMA was given a week to respond to this and the General Medical Council were not even consulted at all. This totally reverses medical and prescriber legal responsibility. So who is legally responsible? How do the pharmacists feel about the fact that they might be held answerable for changing the drug? Or is the government going to underwrite that? So I think that it has been basically that this has been appallingly handled and has been snuck in with no scrutiny and no debate. The member for Leicester South talked about cost and time saving for GPs and, secondary to that, the impact on patient safety. If you look at the basis for the review in a year, it says number 1 will be on the function of the market and number 2 will be the impact on patients. So again, we see that patient safety is not being put at the heart of this. This is not properly thought through, particularly if it is envisaged as a long-term solution to shortages of drugs. This no deal should now be off the table last week. There should be time to look at this properly, consult properly, and come up with something that will not endanger patients.
Norman Lamb.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I very much agree with the concerns that have been raised by the SNP spokesperson. A general point, first of all, I recognise that this is not being introduced purely for no-deal planning, but clearly there's a recognition that the risk of shortages increases in a no-deal scenario. And it just seems to me that it absolutely beggars belief that there were cabinet ministers in this government willing last Thursday to purposefully vote against an extension and in favour, therefore, of the risk of a no deal in just a few days' time, knowing that the risk to patients would increase as a result of doing that, putting patients at risk. And it is extraordinary that ministers in a government could choose to vote in that way, knowing that patients would be put at greater risk. I want to address particularly the concern of patients with epilepsy and the concerns that have been raised by the really good organisation SUDEP Action. Just for those who are unaware, SUDEP means sudden unexpected deaths in epilepsy. So we are talking here about all of those people who lose their lives as a result of epilepsy. And there are very real and legitimate concerns about the impacts of this measure on those people. And to bring it into really sharp focus, Simon Lees, one of the trustees of SUDEP Action, who has epilepsy, was today refused the supply of one of his 3 epilepsy medications because of shortage. Today that happened. Now, his brother died from epilepsy shortly after his medication was changed. So the risk to patients is very real. Now, as others have said, pharmacists are highly skilled professionals, but they are not specialist prescribers or skilled in assessing the risk of unexpected death through epilepsy. There is a particular concern, I should say, Madam Deputy Speaker, about those people with a learning disability who may also have epilepsy, who are particularly at risk. And those pharmacists, as the SNP spokesperson has already said, do not have access to the full patient record. The need for these patients for consistency of supply, of dosing, of timing and the formulation of anti-epileptic drugs is absolutely critical. There is a real risk when medications change. That's why specialist prescribers play such an important role in any change to a patient with epilepsy. Person-centred prescribing and patient and medication management is the most effective way to keep these patients safe. So little wonder that these people and the organisation that supports them is so concerned about this. Now, I would also want to make some particular points that SUDEP Action have raised. The current documentation on the protocol indicates that there is no requirement for patients to be made aware of medication changes. Now, that just seems to me to be extraordinary, or a recognition of the channels available to them should they wish to challenge or question those changes. Without these safeguards, people with epilepsy may be unaware of medication changes that have occurred, putting them at significant risk, particularly if these changes result in increased side effects or changing seizure control. Third, it is unclear whether the pharmacist, the original prescriber or the government are ultimately accountable for adverse effects. This is the point I made in my challenge to the Minister, caused by one of the protocols being activated. Should a death occur following a lack of consistency of supply of the usual medication, then who is held to account for that change? As others have said, Madam Deputy Speaker, it seems to me to be essential that the government makes publicly available a list of the medications that are at risk of shortage. There should be an early warning system for prescribers so that they are aware of the risks of medications running short in supply. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, to conclude, there are legitimate and serious concerns here, and that is why I will be joining in voting in favour of this motion.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad that we've had the opportunity to have this debate today. And like other honourable members, I want to focus my remarks on the impact these changes could have on those with epilepsy, and thank SUDEP Action, as my honourable friend has mentioned, for the work that they have done to bring these concerns to the fore. And can I say I also agree with many of the concerns that my right honourable friend expressed in his opening remarks. I know that the Secretary of State, who was here previously, was unable to address the bereaved families and clinicians at the recent summit held by SUDEP Action, but I would ask the Minister today, and ask the Secretary of State was in his place until recently, whether he would Secretary of State is there, whether he would meet with myself, representatives of SUDEP Action and other honourable members of this House to talk directly to families about the concerns that they have. Would the Secretary of State perhaps agree to do that? It would be very, very helpful if he could. Madam Deputy Speaker, medicine shortages pose a serious risk to people with epilepsy. As honourable members are aware, it's a high-risk condition requiring complex, tailored care, and many people with epilepsy, as other honourable members have said, are particularly vulnerable to changes to that care. I've recently met with families, those of Rachel Shah, whose daughter Emily died aged 19, shortly after a non-specialist prescriber made an error with her medication. The family and the non-specialist were entirely unaware of the risks of sudden unexpected deaths in epilepsy, and the error wasn't noticed. Quite shocking, Madam Deputy Speaker. Studies show that people who are on existing medications are put at risk when medicines are changed. Tried and tested systems mean that when there is a medicine shortage, specialist prescribers are involved in changes who have both expertise and access to the full patient record. There are known risk factors which can increase the risk of death amongst people with epilepsy. However, these can be carefully managed through open, positive relationships between clinicians and patients. These clinicians have had responsibility often for patients' medication, worked up with the patient, often for many, many years. The serious shortage protocols passed under the Human Medicines Amendment Regulations of 2019 gives pharmacists the right to supply a different quantity or pharmaceutical quality of medicine in the event of the country experiencing a serious shortage of prescription-only medicines. Pharmacists are skilled professionals in medicines, as other honourable members have said, and medicines management. but they are not specialist prescribers, nor are they specialists in assessing SUDEP or other epilepsy risks in individuals, nor do they have access to full patient records. I'll give way to the Minister.
I just, with your indulgence, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd just like to reassure the Honourable Member for North Norfolk and the Honourable Gentleman. We don't consider that treatment for epilepsy would be appropriately covered by a serious shortage protocol for exactly the reasons that both honourable members have outlined, which are that this is specialist prescribing and very bespoke to the patient. So in the event of a shortage of those epilepsy drugs, the clear guidance would be for the pharmacist to refer the patient back to their prescriber. The shortage protocols will be very tightly defined within given circumstances as to what appropriate drug would be an alternative treatment. But these are by no means meant to be very one-size-fits-all.
Thank the Minister for that reassurance. I think we want to see that in writing, and that clarity is incredibly important. So when that guidance is published, the reassurance is there for people with epilepsy and their families. It's incredibly important. Laws that sought to allow changes in the supply of the prescription of epilepsy medications, we should remember this, were rejected in 2010 after a public consultation that highlighted major patient safety concerns. And MHRA guidance in 2017 includes vital safeguards against switching medication for people with epilepsy. So these issues have actually been interrogated in the past. A precautionary approach concerned with patient safety would include a number of things: analysis and openness about the causes of medical shortages, including an impact and risk assessment, an aim to avoid any risk of worsening medical shortages, following good practice in the regulation of medical shortages, including training and communication arrangements for all affected, and to include clear, robust and timely accountability to patients and the public for adverse events and avoidable deaths. Nurses and clinicians are not able to access a number of medications at the present time. They need to know which medications are on the list for likely shortage and what are all the necessary measures being exhausted to prevent those shortages. People with epilepsy are recognised in current legislation as being a high-risk group. They must be protected against medication shortages for any medication they take, not just their epilepsy medication, by ensuring that there is a requirement in the legislation and in any accompanying guidance for the involvement of the specialist prescriber at all times. To be fair, that's the assurance that the Minister sought to give this evening. It's not good enough to say, and I think this point needs reiterating, in the explanatory memorandum that protocols will not apply to certain epilepsy treatments where a brand is required. Any change to the MHRA 2017 guidance on epilepsy medication should be avoided, though if it is required due to serious shortage, it must be following public consultation with the involvement of the third sector and patients. I think one of the problems with the debate tonight is it seems to me that patient groups feel they've been excluded from this process thus far. And I urge the Minister, in the spirit that she's engaged this evening, that if the Secretary of State isn't willing to make SUDEP Action or doesn't have the time, perhaps the Minister will agree to do so with myself and other honourable members. I also want to say that the Government should look to make publicly available the list of medications at risk of shortage. People living with long-term health conditions and their clinicians knowing about serious shortages which may affect them provides opportunities for them to feed into any consultations and debate. An early warning system to prescribers is absolutely essential. This must, however, be extended to all specialist prescribers. Many are on the front line trying to ensure continuity of medication for patients and can provide the necessary reassurance to patients if they're aware of potential shortages. We shouldn't forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, the anxiety that this will cause amongst already extremely vulnerable people, which can lead to further health problems. So we really do need to see all those involved in this chain in a position, where appropriate, to offer clarity, maximum information and reassurance. It's also important that the Government should publish an operational framework and guidance to ensure good practice guidelines for managing medicine shortages within a safe framework, with a commitment by the Government to patient-centred and shared care decision-making. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, perhaps this is the most important point that's been made by other honourable members. It's still not clear, Minister, where accountability lies in the case of an adverse event or worse, a death, where there's been a failure of continuity of supply lines. It is not clear where accountability lies. Now, this is an issue that's been highlighted by the Pharmaceutical Defence Association, which obviously are very concerned about the negative effect potentially on pharmacists. But the greater concern is the potential effect on patients and families at risk. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, this law is not simply another complication caused by Brexit, but it may present serious challenges for many years to come. It is first and foremost about patient safety, and in those circumstances, the Government really do need to take appropriate time and care over these decisions.
I'm good, madam.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to make a short contribution to this debate on a statutory instrument. It is so ironic that one of the main Brexit campaign slogans was on the side of the bus, £350 million for the NHS. But one of the most serious problems that we're now having to look at is medicine shortages in the event of Brexit. One of the questions that is still not clear from the Minister is the extent to which these medicine shortages are related to Brexit. Common sense suggests that this is a Brexit statutory instrument, and I'm assuming it went through the usual Brexit process of going to the Special Statutory Instrument Committee. But the Minister has not made clear why we are having these shortages in medicines, why we which are happening already. As my honourable friend said, I've also had a constituent with a child who has epilepsy, who is now finding it difficult to get their child's prescription. So, if this isn't Brexit related, how come all these shortages are suddenly happening now at a time when the pharmaceutical industry is being told that they need to stockpile? And by the way, Madam Deputy Speaker,
thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I wholeheartedly support the points that she makes and the concern she's raising about the potential link to Brexit, which would seem to many members an obvious connection. Does she agree with me that Brexit is not only threatening the NHS through these potential sources of medicines, but it's also threatening the staffing of our NHS? I represent a seat where 13% of the staff at the local hospital come from EU countries. Many are leaving and going home. It's a deep concern to our residents.
of course, what my honourable friend says about staff shortages and Brexit is absolutely right. What I was going to go on to say was that I have a Glaxo factory in my constituency, and obviously I have discussed this issue with them as well. And they're also extremely underwhelmed by the government's no-deal planning. They're extremely underwhelmed by the fact that they're having to pay for these extra stockpiles at the moment. And all these Brexit costs, which are being put onto the industrialists, mean, of course, there's that much less money for R&D, that much less money for investment and job creation, and all the things that we would all like to see. Now, turning to the individual conditions which we know are most likely to be affected, I think it's extremely notable that there are very high numbers of people with these conditions. So there are 4 million people in this country with diabetes. There are 500,000 people with epilepsy. There are 250,000 people whose allergies are so serious that they need an EpiPen. I would have thought, given that we've clearly got 5, 6, perhaps 10 million people whose health is likely to be at risk if there are medicine shortages, that the government would have done not just a full risk and impact assessment, but would have produced for us today, alongside the statutory instrument, the protocols. The Minister knows which drugs we're talking about, which conditions we're talking about. Surely, given all the problems we've had with the industry and the doctors and the patient groups not being properly consulted, it would have been sensible to make those protocols at this moment so that we could have looked at them alongside the statutory instrument. And I hope the Minister is going to come to the dispatch box and answer some of these points, because she's shaking her head in the negative at the moment.
Can I just say to the Honourable Lady, this is a tool to manage serious medicine shortages. I don't expect any medicine shortages, but this tool will exist in the event that they do. So the idea that we can come together with a list, we don't anticipate there will need to be a list.
Brexit is now 11 days away. The possibility of collapsing with out of Europe with no deal is obviously far less likely following the votes of last week, but it is still a possibility. And at that point, the likelihood, the possibility, the probability of these medicine shortages is going to increase very significantly. So here we are, less than a fortnight, and the Minister has not got these protocols in draft at the moment. Well, the Minister's still chuntering, but I'm sorry, she hasn't provided us with the reassurance which we want. I mean, I speak as a person who carries an EpiPen. I'm not very taken with the idea that I'm not going to be able to get an EpiPen. My husband's not going to be very taken if he can't get his epilepsy tablets. And if the Minister thinks, and Department of Health officials think, this is a way to save money, they couldn't be more wrong. Because when things go wrong, when a person has a fit, when a person has an anaphylactic shock, they're taken into A&E. You might have to be in A&E for 12 hours. That's not cheap. That's not a saving. Of course, it's extremely dangerous as well. The rate at which people who have epileptic fits are liable to die is 1 in 100. 1 in 100 fits leads to death. This is a much too great risk, which ministers are taking with their fellow citizens' lives.
Order. The question is, as on the order paper, motion number 2. As matters that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Aye. Division, clear the lobby. order. The question is motion number 2 as on order. The question is motion number 2 as on the order paper. As many as that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary, no.
No.
Tellers for the ayes, Colin Fletcher and Bambo Sharalambo. Tellers for the noes, Joe Churchill and Michelle Donnelly. Lock the doors. Order!
The ayes to the right, 240, and the noes to the left, 292.
The ayes to the right, 240. The noes to the left, 292. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Unlock. We now come to motion